You're weaving a number of things together. So the first is your discovery that if you look at the data, that things are getting better at a rate that's so remarkable that it is really nothing short of miraculous. And you produce dozens of graphs showing that in Enlightenment Now. I noticed the same thing about 3 years ago when I was working for a UN panel on economic sustainability. For the Secretary General, the original narrative was extremely pessimistic. It detailed how we were despoiling the planet and how everything was getting worse and how we were at each other's throats. And I started to read extremely widely, and I found that on measure after measure, with some notable exceptions like oceanic overfishing, we have been doing so staggeringly much better in the last 150 years that you can't believe it on almost every measure you can imagine, which is exactly what you detail out in Enlightenment Now. And then now that's a secret, let's say, people don't know about it, and that's strange. And then you also associated it with a critique of the Enlightenment and scientific rationality. And it seems to me that you're implying, or perhaps you're stating explicitly that there's a connection between the pessimism and the lack of knowledge about this and the critique of the Enlightenment and rationality. Because there's a question here: if things are getting so much better, and if the news is overwhelming on that front, I mean, some of the things you outline are like the decreases in starvation, I suppose, are the most remarkable, and the provision of bountiful food on less and less farmland, which is not something that people know. It's like, if all this is happening, why don't we know about it, and how is it linked to how do you think, if at all, it's linked to the critique of Enlightenment rationality?
Yeah, one of the reasons is an interaction between the nature of journalism and the nature of cognition. Namely, the news is about what happens, not what doesn't happen. And a lot of the very beneficial developments consist of things that don't happen. Countries that are at peace that used to be at war. Kids who are not starving. Terrorist attacks that do not happen. You never see a journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that's been at peace for 40 years. But if a war breaks out, you can be sure that we'll hear about it. All the more so now that a majority of humanity consists of on-the-spot video journalists, thanks to smartphones. Also, bad things can happen quickly. Things can blow up. Wars can start. A massacre can happen. But good things aren't built in a day, and they often consist of incremental improvements of a few percentage points a year that compound, that accumulate, but that can never make the news because they never happen all of a sudden on a Thursday in October. Together with all the cognitive impediments to understanding the state of the world, the fact that news reports memorable events, and we know from the study of the cognition of risk and probability from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, that we tend to assess probability and risk by a shortcut called the availability heuristic. Namely, the easier it is to dredge up an example from memory, the more likely we think something is. And so people think that tornadoes kill a lot of people, but they don't realize that falling off of ladders kills far more people. Just because when someone falls off a ladder, it doesn't make the news, but when there is a tornado, it does.
Yeah, do you know that solar power kills more people than nuclear power every year?
I did not know that, but it doesn't surprise me because nuclear power kills no one. But
well,
and I suppose installers fall off roofs.
That's exactly right. Installers fall off roofs. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So
perfect example.
Yeah, exactly. And well, so that's interesting. So you can imagine that. So good news is, or bad news is sudden. It's dramatic. We're tilted towards the processing of negative information in any case.
That's right. And we don't naturally compute a ratio between occurrences and non-occurrences, which is, of course, what goes into probability and rational assessment of risk and probability. So there's that, but it's more than that, because in intellectual life, in large parts of academia, among commentators and pundits, there is an ideology of decline. It goes back to the 19th century, part of the counter-enlightenment that arose in as a reaction to Enlightenment hopes for progress and rationality, that said that holds that society Western civilization is teetering on the brink, or it's circling the drain, and it's going to collapse any time now. And it's up to the intellectuals and commentators and to point out how decadent and degenerate society is. And to people like that, news about progress comes almost as an affront.
Mhm.
The reaction is, hey, we've been warning all of you about how society is on the verge of collapse. Don't come around and tell us that everything's going fine. What are we going to do now?